Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Min San-hee with our group of foreign correspondents. It's a pleasure to see you all again. Right, so what were some of the stories that caught your attention this week, Marcus?
Well, I was mostly looking at the inauguration of Donald Trump. That was sort of the big story of the week.
We will make America great again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you.
I was also doing interviews with North Korean defectors. Is a story I'm working on.
Elise?
Well, we have a huge staff covering Washington, so I've been responsible for Samsung, really. Prosecutors who sought to arrest E.J. Young, and then the decision not to issue an arrest warrant for him. And then finally, the announcement earlier this week of the Galaxy Note 7 investigation and what went wrong there.
Frank?
I did both of the stories they talked about. I talked about the Trump inauguration and what it might mean for South Korea and the region in terms of economy and security. And then I did a couple of stories about Samsung, the announcement of what went wrong. It was the batteries, as previously thought, and the sort of record profits over the last 3 years, Samsung Electronics.
Right. Well, earlier this month, we spoke about a diplomatic standoff between Seoul and Tokyo over the installation of a statue outside the Japanese consulate in Busan. Well, last week, Japan raised tensions higher by taking issue with Korea's Dokdo Island. We have more in this report. Korea and Japan started the year off with a diplomatic row over the installation of a statue symbolizing wartime sex slave victims. And now another conflict has erupted, challenging already icy relations. On the 20th, major Japanese newspapers reported that Tokyo had called on Seoul to revise a map using the name Dokdo for a Korean eastern island on the Pyeongchang Olympic Games website. Japan claims that the reference is in violation of the Olympic Charter Rule 50, Article 2, which prohibits any demonstration of political, religious or racial propaganda at Olympic sites, venues and other areas. It claims the island is disputed territory, asserting that labeling it Dokdo in and of itself should be considered propaganda.
これは竹島の領有権あるいは日本海の保障に関する我が国の立場に照らして受け入れられないと考えます。
To this, the Pyeongchang Organizing Committee said there is nothing to be discussed and that the request is not worth responding to. Also, in a statement issued by the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Seoul said it deplores that the Japanese government has made preposterous claims once again over Dokdo. It also called on Tokyo to immediately stop its useless claims. From the landmark sexual slavery agreement to the so-called Comfort Women statue, and now the issue of Dokdo Island, tensions between the two countries abound. Marcus, just out of curiosity, have you experienced any discomfort while reporting on the Dokdo issue?
I haven't personally, no, but I know a lot of foreigners will get in trouble over this issue and will have a difficult time trying to navigate their way through this issue. I know companies, for example, from other countries. I remember IKEA, the Swedish furniture company, a few years ago when they set up their first warehouse in South Korea, they were selling maps that said the Sea of Japan.
Oh, the waters surrounding Dokdo.
Right. And they got into a lot of trouble, and I know that they had no idea what they were getting into. They were just selling maps that they imagined wouldn't create any trouble. But they had to recall the maps, they had to issue apologies, and I know that happens to foreigners sometimes.
Right. Elise, what are your personal views on the Dokdo issue?
I think it's a regional issue. Obviously, this isn't something that I have had to cover at all because this is so limited to Japan and Korea. And it just depends on how you look at it. I mean, Koreans will claim the rock based on ancient history when all sorts of different fishermen were able to, from different countries, were able to, and different nationalities were able to fish on this particular rock you could not live on. It was after the 20th century and after 1904 in particular where this whole notion of sovereignty changed, and you had to have these sort of records and an international agreement on it. And that, just by coincidence, was when this sea lion farmer, the Japanese man, petitioned the Japanese government to claim the island. So it was sort of like a coincidence of timing in history that they claimed it at that particular moment when the international community happened to recognize claims in this particular way. Obviously that changed following World War II when the US, and then the outbreak of the Korean War, when the US used Dokdo as a place for US Allied troops to, or the U.S. planes to sort of land and refuel, or at least kind of take a break. But then following that, in the San Francisco Treaty, didn't actually allow the island to be claimed one way or the other. So you can't ignore American sort of fault in the fact that this remains to be a territorial dispute today.
Right. As we saw in the report, Tokyo used diplomatic channels to protest the inclusion of Dokdo on the website of the organizing committee for the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. Do you see this as a violation of the Olympic Charter to include Dokdo and related information on the website? Frank, we'll start with you.
Yes, you know, I kind of do. Having visited there, like I went to Ulleungdo, it's actually an inhabitable island. It's fairly big. People do live there. There is some industry there, especially squid. I remember the harbor being full of squid drying on big racks. But Dokdo is an uninhabitable island. There's been a couple that have lived there. It's been occupied by the Korean Coast Guard and security forces since about 1954. But people can't really live there or do any industry there. The surrounding waters, of course, are full of some fish. But it's not someplace you can live. And it's included in the map, whereas Ulleungdo is not included in the Pyeongchang Olympic map. So that sort of indicates, I think, the real sort of political motivation behind putting Dokdo on that map. And that's something that the Olympic movement really wants to avoid.
Right, so you do think it's an unnecessary political message?
Yes, yes. In this case, I do think it's an unnecessary political message that has really sort of inflamed tensions between the two countries.
Right. What are your thoughts, Elise?
Why inflame tensions right now? I mean, to raise this in a time of Olympics when all these countries should be in unity and an effort to sort of come together for the games, I think is unnecessarily political as well.
In this next report, we delve into the history of the dispute between Korea and Japan over Dokdo Island. Dokdo Island is Korea's easternmost island. Korea's foreign ministry clearly states Dokdo is Korean territory historically, geographically, and under international law. According to Samguk-sagi, or the Chronicles of the Three Kingdoms, a historical text written in 1145, Usan-guk was subjugated to Shilla Kingdom during King Chijung's 13th year of reign. Usan-guk is thought to be the modern Ulleungdo and Dokdo Islands, while the 13th year under King Chijung refers to the year 512. In other words, Dokdo Island was first recorded as Korean territory some 1,500 years ago. The island is also mentioned in Sejong-shillok, Jiri-ji, the geography section of the annals of King Sejong's reign, which was written in 1454. Meanwhile, Japan continues to claim Dokdo is its sovereign territory, having announced its annexation through Shimane Prefecture Public Notice No. 40 back in 1905. But the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers Instructions No. 677, issued on January 29, 1946 after Korea's independence from Japan, shows Dokdo Island was excluded from Japan's administrative rule. In January 1952, immediately after the Korean government issued its declaration of maritime sovereignty that encompassed Dokdo Island, the Japanese government sent diplomatic papers arguing against it. This is what reignited the dispute between the two countries. But proof that Japan acknowledged Dokdo Island as Korean territory has also been surfacing. In 2015, an official Japanese government map from 1897 was discovered identifying Dokdo Island as Korean territory. Last year, more evidence was found in a Japanese government-issued geography textbook that was used in 1912 for middle school students. The map on one of the pages excludes Ulleungdo and Dokdo Islands from Japanese territory. Japan has continuously been making territorial claims over Dokdo Island, but historical records clearly show that the easternmost island is Korea's sovereign territory. In your opinion, Marcus, why is Japan making relentless claims to an island that the oldest historical records here in Korea show is Korean territory?
Well, Japan is saying that they already claimed the islands a long time ago, and they're also saying that their claim has been recognized by the appropriate international organizations. You know, it's tricky for foreigners to evaluate the evidence, I think, both the Korean, on the Korean side and on the Japanese side. I went to a dinner at the Japanese ambassador's house in Copenhagen many years ago, where he invited journalists and academics for dinner, and before we sat down for dinner, he showed us sort of a PowerPoint presentation of the Japanese claims to the islands. And he showed us a lot of documents, a lot of sort of photos of old documents, a lot of evidence. We were presented with evidence for, I think, 45 minutes or an hour before we sat down. Then, when we started having dinner, the issue of the comfort women came up. And the ambassador there sort of presented us with a very one-sided Japanese narrative of that issue. And I think that sort of changed our minds during dinner. We kind of thought, well, if that's how he feels about the comfort women issue, how about those documents he was showing us
about
Dokdo, you know? So I think we walked away from there, you know, even more confused than we were coming in. It's very difficult to evaluate the evidence for outsiders.
Frank, Marcus mentioned this earlier. He talked about the disputes surrounding also the name of the waters around Dokdo Island. Koreans, we call it the East Sea. Japan calls it the Sea of Japan, which unfortunately is the name used by many in the international community. Do you see this reality as affecting Korea's sovereignty over Dokdo?
You know, I'm not sure about that. I don't see this issue as really a territorial issue. I think it's just another nationalist football that's kicked around by politicians to drum up domestic support. You know, we saw Donald Trump do that. We've seen that in Europe. We talked about this on the program before when we talked about European nationalism. I think this is really the same thing, and it has little to do with the actual territorial claims that countries have, but more the motivations of politicians to get support, get themselves reelected, embellish their own resume.
I see. Are your respective countries involved in any similar disputes?
Well, my country, we talked about this on an earlier program. My country's involved in a dispute over the maritime border with Canada. Denmark and Canada, they both claim the same small rock in the waters between Greenland and Canada. It's been known to be one of the more peaceful disputes because when the Canadian Army patrolled those waters, they would put up the Canadian flag, and then a few days later when the Danish Navy patrolled the same waters, they would go up on the island, take down the Canadian flag, put up the Danish flag, and then leave a bottle of Danish schnapps there for the Canadians. Denmark has been with other countries, not just Canada, but a country like Norway, which we have a very friendly relationship with today. When we drew up the maritime border with Norway, there was a lot of negotiations going back and forth because there was made a big oil find just on the Norwegian side of the border. It was the largest offshore oil find back then. It was 1971. It would have made a big difference to Denmark if we had negotiated that maritime border a little better.
I think that's a really good point too about resources, because as we move forward, industry is getting better at discovering new resources. There's more oil being discovered all the time, and Canada is involved in sort of territorial disputes now in the Arctic because now they're becoming able to extract resources, in particular oil and gas, from the Arctic regions, whereas previously nobody really cared about it. And they might be more, countries around the world might be more inclined to compromise on these types of disputes and then find out later, oh, there's a whole bunch of oil there or natural resources that we didn't know about and couldn't get at before, and then make stronger, more, aggressive claims.
Now, aside from its dispute with Korea, Japan is also embroiled in territorial conflict with China and Russia. Why do you believe Japan is clashing over territory with its neighbors?
Well, this has a lot to do with what remains of its former empire. I mean, I think that's an important point, that this is not the only particular island dispute going on for Japan. And for it, it's a matter of national identity in the same way that the clash over the rocks here or near Korea happened to be a matter of Korean identity.
Some observers believe Japan's interest in Dokdo goes beyond that of territory to that of politics. We explain in this report. In August last year, Korea's foreign ministry summoned Kohei Maruyama, a minister of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. It was to officially protest Japan's repeated claims of sovereignty over Dokdo Island, noted in Tokyo's annual defense white paper for the 12th year.
역사적, 지리적, 국제법적으로 명백히 우리 고유의 영토인 독도에 대한 부당한 영유권 주장을 또다시 포함시킨 데 대해 강력히 항의하며 이에 즉각적 철회를 촉구한다.
Japan's claims over Dokdo Island have been intensifying, especially under the current Shinzo Abe administration. Last year, the government ordered high school textbook publishers that had failed to outline Dokdo Island as being illegally occupied by Korea to make revisions accordingly. As a result, out of 35 high school social science textbooks, 27, or about 77%, state that Korea is illegally occupying Dokdo Island. Not only that, in April last year, Japan's Cabinet Secretariat launched an English website offering documents that support Tokyo's unilateral territorial claims over Dokdo Island, in addition to its existing service in Japanese. Seeing recently that a fundraising campaign had kicked off to install the symbolic sex slave statue on Dokdo Island in Korea, Tokyo has stepped up its claims over the island.
我が国固有の領土である。この立場に照らしてもご指摘の点は受け入れられない。
Japan's territorial ambitions over Korea's Dokdo Island appear to be mounting by the day, an issue which will only further strain already wobbly ties between the two countries. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, so his national approval ratings, rise to 67% following his government's hardline stance regarding the Dokdo issue and, of course, the Comfort Women's statue. Now, regardless of his popularity at home, how do you see his standing in the international arena, Marcus?
Well, I think you really have to recognize that Shinzo Abe is trying to be more of a global player. He wants to be involved on the global level more than his predecessors have. This also is one of the reasons, I think, for why they changed the legislation in Japan, now making it possible for Japan to be engaged in, have its military engaged outside of the Japanese borders. They're also responding to a stronger, more assertive China in the region, and they feel they have to be involved also militarily.
Some believe Tokyo continues to take issue with Dokdo amid hopes to take the issue to the International Court of Justice. It's a move that Korea has declared absurd, as the island belongs to Korea. Do you believe, Elise, that the issue should be settled at the International Court of Justice, despite the fact, of course, that the court has no legal force?
I think my hope is that the two sides that have the most sort of passion on this issue, Korea and Japan, come to an agreement on this on their own. Historian Alexis Dutton has spoken of kind of a shared claim to the island, or she has separately encouraged Korea, if it were to win some sort of claim, that it sort of forego any sort of economic benefit, but instead sort of pledge to the UN that any resources from the island would actually benefit the earth and sustainability and the planet. And so there's all these different proposals out there that would bring this dispute to an end without some sort of international court. But obviously we saw it happen with the South China Sea and the Philippines, and the Hague Tribunal made a decision on some of the rocks that have now become islands thanks to China's island building in the South China Sea. And that decision really hasn't changed China's behavior. So I don't know that a decision at from The Hague would change the behavior of either Japan or Korea on this.
The best thing for Korea to do is to just maintain the status quo. They have possession of the island, so taking it to some tribunal isn't going to benefit them at all. And resisting that is probably a good idea.
Marcus, what would be an appropriate diplomatic stance for Korea to adopt, to ensure that the international community is aware that Dokdo belongs to Korea?
Well, I think Korea is doing a lot to draw attention to this issue right now. There's also speaking to the dispute over the name of the sea that the islands are in, so whether to call it the Sea of Japan or the East Sea. Right now, Korea is proposing sort of a dual name where you use both names, similar to what exists now in Europe. For example, in the English Channel, where there's they call it the English Channel in the United Kingdom, but in France they call it La Manche. So that's something that's being proposed by Korea, which sounds pretty reasonable, in my opinion, that you would just use the dual name. Somebody here in Korea told me, well, imagine if when your country, Denmark, was invaded by Germany during the Second World War, they renamed the waters between Germany and Denmark, let's say the Northern German Sea. And then after the Second World War, they kept calling it the Northern German Sea, and they insisted that you should also call it the Northern German Sea. So I think if you put it that way to Europeans such as myself, I think there's a lot of sympathy for the Korean position in the case of how to rename the sea around the islands.
Growing up, for instance, I had never heard of the East Sea. I only know it as the Sea of Japan because that's what AP-style, National Geographic, international bodies that are cartography bodies understand the name of the sea to be. So again, I would return to what I said at the outset, which is this is absolutely a regional issue. It's an unfortunate one. And it's one that, in the interests of all of the shared interests between Korea and Japan, I hope that the two nations can work out on their own without either going to tribunals, without any violence, of course, and without any sort of cost to resources, because it seems like of all the things that the two countries could be working together on.
Right. Okay, today we talked about Korea's concerns regarding Japan's interest in Dokdo Island. Marcus, how would you assess today's discussion?
I thought it was a very interesting discussion. There's a lot of maritime disputes going on all over the world that has to do with different issues. This one doesn't have to do with access to natural resources, but a lot of other political, cultural, and historical issues. Interesting to discuss.
Lise?
Well, this is really timely. Obviously, currently the Japanese ambassador to Korea is not able to return to Korea, partly because of historical disputes. One, the comfort women issue, and then second, the issue over what's happening with these rocks. And so the fact that it is still relevant today is one that sort of reminds you that we're never quite divorced from the history of this region.
I once did an interview with a financial reporter, and he said no company has ever withdrawn from Japan because of these types of disputes, or withdrawn from South Korea because of these types of disputes. But I wonder how many businessmen in each country have not pursued business interests in the other country. because of these sort of long-standing antagonisms between the two countries. So I think it could have some sort of economic impact, and that might, hopefully encourage, some understanding of that might encourage the two countries to kind of tone down the nationalist rhetoric a little bit.
Dokdo Island is made up of two islets, Dokdo and Seodo. It's more than 187,000 square meters, that's roughly 7 football fields. It's home to 2 permanent residents, a Korean couple, and more than 30 security officials who guard the region. It's also Korean territory. Thank you for watching.